No. Like, fuck no. Well, that was easy. Well, until next time, may the privilege be with you. Stay until snowflakes. Okay. You guys are gonna want a little bit more of an explanation than that. Well, fine. Yes, we're gonna have to do a bit of a deep dive into this. So, hey everyone, my name is Jacob, but the trolls, they call me Snowflake. Alright, so, I don't know how widespread this whole debate kind of is. It's definitely become quite the hot topic up here in Canada. I don't know if it's spread to the States or not. Maybe a little bit, but for those of you who don't know, there is a big debate around whether police should march in Pride or not. And this was all kind of sparked in 2016 by the Toronto chapter of Black Lives Matter stopping the Pride parade for, a little bit and presenting a list of demands. And one of those demands was the removal of police and police floats from the parade. Now, this has been reported on quite a lot since, and it's recently cropped up as well. They recently just had a protest at Edmonton Pride, pretty much around the same sort of thing. And so, it's one that's kind of has popped up every year or so around the time of Pride. And since this is Pride Month up here in Canada, I figured why not confront this sort of a topic for this month's video, or this half of the month's video, or podcast, or whatever you want to call this thing. And why don't we delve into the idea of, hey, why maybe shouldn't police actually walk in Pride? Maybe they actually shouldn't walk in Pride, and here's why. And I haven't seen a lot of discussion around this online. Certainly not as a lot of people talking about the actual events kind of that spawned it all. And since that's the case, I guess it's important for someone to step in and explain what happened, because guess what? I was actually there when it happened, believe it or not. So you're going to hear it straight from pretty much a first-hand account of what happened. Not necessarily an entirely first-hand account. I didn't necessarily see the protest itself, but I was there and saw the parade of that day, on that day when Black Lives Matter staged their sit-in. So I think I'm going to give you guys kind of that story, and then I think I'm going to delve more into, at least in Canada's perspective, why maybe the police shouldn't walk in Pride. Why maybe the police still have a long way to go before they are able to be accepted and able to be included in Pride celebrations. Maybe show why Black Lives Matter was right to do what they did. Now, I will also have to go into a bunch of dates and stuff. I will have to provide quite a lot of historical context to the question of should police walk in Pride. So just so you guys know, I am going to be reading from my notes to a certain extent in this video when I start listing off dates and stuff. So if I sound really terrible when that happens, now you know why this podcast is a stream of consciousness and not scripted at all, because I am absolutely terrible at reading notes. So yeah, the story of how I bore witness to Canadian LGBT history. So, sort of a bit of a background about me. I, of course, am a raging homosexual, as I've said on the podcast before, and I knew I was gay probably from around the time I was like 12, 13, pretty much from around the time I was a teenager. And I was out to my friends at school pretty early. I was, friends with a number of people in school, and they all knew that I was gay in high school. But I didn't tell my parents until I was 16 years old. So it's been about 10 years now since I came out, which, maybe it's a bit of an accomplishment, I don't know, but at the time my parents were all right with it. They were okay, but mostly they just didn't want other people really to know, and they really didn't want the rest of my family to know. That all changed, however, when one of my cousins came out as trans, and so that was kind of also my opportunity to tell the rest of my family as well. And the rest of my family has been like absolutely cool with it, totally awesome with it. They're all like, sort of like, we're all very kind of progressive people despite being kind of very white trash. So we're the good type of white trash, you know? And so, and so yeah, so that really went well. And so 2016 was kind of the first year that both me and my cousin were both out at the same time and out to our collective families. And so, you know, they were going to Pride that year. It was going to be their first Pride too. It was going to be him, his mother, his father, and his sister. And so they asked, well, hey, do you want to come with us? I said, absolutely. I am totally fucking coming to this. I totally want to come to Pride. I had tried to go to Pride the year before, but a little thing to know about Toronto Pride is that it's almost always on the hottest day of the year. It's always super, super hot and super, super sunny. And the year I went there in 2015, it was like literally the hottest day of the year. It was 35 degrees Celsius, not including the humidex. It had like a 45 humidex. And the street that like they have Pride on every year, one side of the street is always shaded by the buildings behind it, and the other side of the street is always in sunlight, not unless you can get in the shadow of a skyscraper or something. And I always wind up on the sunny side of the street. And that year it was just brutal. There was no shade at all on that side of the street, and it was packed. And I got about as far as the Dykes on Bikes, and I was like, no, I'm going home. Plus, I was also wearing sandals that really didn't fit my feet, and so I was getting blisters on my feet and stuff, so it was not fun. But 2016 was a blast. I loved it, and I've loved going to Pride ever since. But yeah, so what wound up happening is that like my cousin, my aunt, my uncle, and we all like head down to the parade, and we kind of show up there, and we're kind of worried that we're going to be late. And so we go there, and we see that, oh, like the parade hasn't even started yet. Okay, great. And so we kind of stand there, and we stand there a little bit more, stand there more, and a little bit more. We're like, oh, the parade's not coming. It should be coming by now. And so we were also with a couple of family friends as well, and so they went up to see what was going on. The person came back and said, like, oh, someone stopped the parade. It's like, really, someone stopped the parade? And so we waited a couple more minutes, and eventually they came down, and like Black Lives Matter was like right there, like their like float was like right at the beginning of the parade, and everyone was cheering and happy, and it's like, yay, great. And you know, I didn't think anything of it. I had a blast that day. um my my cousin's sister, my cousin, she was like, you know, oh, Jake, are you gonna fist bump this year? And I was like, damn it, me and I forgot my lube. It's always so hard going in bare-fisted, you know, so it's always fun. I always love to gross people out with my sexuality, so that was fun. But yeah, but it was a blast. I got a bit of a sunburn, but it really didn't hurt or anything. So, but yeah, it was so much fun, and the parade like was massive that year. It was huge. There was loads of floats. It went on for hours, like literally like too dark. And eventually, we were all just so tired that we were just like, oh, we need to go home now. This is going on long. We need to go home now. And so we headed back home. And I went to bed that day, you know, perfectly happy until the next day when I found out, oh, Black Lives Matter had stopped the parade. I'm like, wow, oh, that was what it was. Wow. And I first heard, I was terrified. Not because, like, I oppose Black Lives Matter or anything, like, totally. Like, Black lives absolutely do have to matter, and they are doing absolutely necessary work. What I was worried about, I immediately thought, oh my God, they are going to spin this so badly. People are going to hate this. And they did. The media tore this apart because what had happened was that Black Lives Matter was the featured group. Basically, every year at Pride Toronto always has a group that they feature. And so like this is a group that has done traditionally is a group that has done good things for the community in the last couple of years or so. And so that year they invited Black Lives Matter to be the featured group. But what had happened was that Black Lives Matter, just before the parade started, staged a sit-in where they wound up stopping the parade for about half an hour until the president of Pride Toronto came down and agreed to a list of about 9 demands that they had. He signed it, and the parade was allowed to go through, no problem. He would then later walk back that commitment and say, oh no, I just signed it to get the parade moving. I really didn't mean to agree to anything like that. It is also worth noting that he would later resign as a result of all of this. So one good thing came out of it at least. But the demands were quite varied. But the one that the media focused on was number 8, I believe, which was that the Toronto Police Service be barred from the parade, and that the police would not be allowed to appear in uniform. Note that would not be allowed to appear in uniform, not banning them altogether. As a police officer, you're still more than welcome to show up in Pride and participate with everyone else, but you can't walk as an institution, as a member of the institution in the parade. But the media totally like twisted it as like, oh, you're trying to kick the police out of Pride and stuff. Like, doesn't this go against everything Pride stands for? It's like the police aren't a gay institution. Yes, there are gay police officers. There totally are, but they don't have. It, it's been a really frustrating thing. It was really frustrating, and like Black Lives Matter Toronto in the end was fed up with it too. Like they were literally going on to the news saying like, look, we had loads of other demands here. You guys are focusing on the only one that you can spin negatively. And so yeah, like it was a big thing for a couple months, and that kind of simmered down. It's flared back up though periodically because Pride Toronto had a meeting in January to decide the 2017 parade. And from what I heard from it, most of the like LGBT people who showed up there, like Black Lives Matter Toronto had received like numerous like angry letters and stuff and like angry emails and all this stuff, some of which from LGBT people, which I hate. But during Pride Toronto's annual meeting, I think in January of 2017, to decide what that year's parade was going to be, most of the people who came there spoke out in support of Black Lives Matter and said, yeah, Black Lives Matter did the right thing. Because Pride Toronto has had problems before, and I'll get into those in a second. And so yeah, so that was something that I was very happy to hear that. I was very happy to hear that the Toronto LGBT community really like sort of came out in support of Black Lives Matter as a whole. As I said, this has also since now spread to Edmonton Pride. Edmonton Pride had a protest similar to this year, actually, just earlier, a couple weeks ago, I think. The officers from the Toronto Police Service, for all of you who think that, oh, it's so terrible that they weren't allowed to walk in the 2017 parade, don't worry, New York Pride accepted them, and they walked in New York Pride, but Black Lives Matter in New York really didn't like that either. They were just kind of like, hey, we don't want them down here either. The police shouldn't walk in the parade either. So yeah. So you'll also be happy to know too that Black Lives Matter has absolutely been proven right, which I will get into again later. But so yeah, so that's kind of the story of how I was witness to Canadian LGBT history there. Kind of amazing. And so the year afterwards, last year, I went to the parade again, this time with my father, because all of my fucking relatives were busy that year, and my father refused to let me go alone. And that's because I wore a shirt last year, which said, Pride is a protest, not a pat on the back. And on the back, it had hashtag Black Lives Matter, hashtag Indigenous Lives Matter, we come in all colors. And I'm currently actually redoing that shirt for this year's Pride, which is this Sunday on the 24th. This episode will probably be released later than that, so when you guys are listening to this, I will have not walked on the parade, but I will have been at the parade with my new shirt, with an updated shirt of the same. You will probably see it as the image on YouTube. The YouTube thumbnail will be an image of this shirt, along with a sign which I'll also be holding, which says, "Let Ontario kids have sex ed. Let them know we exist." In response to our current premier, Diet Trump, sorry, Doug Ford, and his campaign promise to remove Ontario's sex ed curriculum, which partially because it teaches about LGBT people and stuff like that. And so those are why the image this podcast is different. So, and the parade like on last year was great. It was much smaller, partially I think because there was a little bit of rain that day. It was forecast to be a little bit rainy, but it rained for like 5 minutes and then it cleared up, and it was hot and sunny like it always is. And but I also kind of think too that like the parade was much smaller, but I also thought it was kind of much better because, you know, Pride celebrations in Toronto are really kind of, traditionally were really much more of just an excuse to party. It was really more just kind of like a party weekend for a lot of straight people. So I think what happened with Black Lives Matter was that it took a lot of the air out of that. It took a lot of the fun out of it for a lot of the people who were really just going there to party and for no other reason. And so like the people who were there, like were there because they wanted to show support. Were there because they were, gay people or, trans people or bi people or allies or whatever. They were there because they actually wanted to be there for what Pride represented. And Black Lives Matter was there again. This time they put them like literally right at the end. Like it was them, the Thai drag queens, and then they were literally taking down the barriers right behind them. But Black Lives Matter, I thought, was very, very gracious. Like, to be perfectly honest, I was expecting them to be bold and brazen, like they always are. And I would have totally been like okay with that. I would have been like, yeah, like I totally understand like why they would do that. Like, because they don't need to censor themselves. They don't need to, gain acceptance. They don't need, to kowtow to people. But they were actually very, very respectful. It was much quieter. They walked in the parade, and the one thing that they were saying was that may we never have to remind you again that Black Lives Matter. And I thought that they were very, very respectful. I thought that it was very gracious of them to do that. Maybe they did that because the police were barred from that last year's parade, and as they are going to be barred from this year's parade, happily, there are a number of reasons for that, not just Black Lives Matter, but again, I'll get to that in a minute. And so, yeah, like there were still people, I could still hear people muttering at the parade, like, wow, they're still here. But I think a lot of people were there to show support for Black Lives Matter. And of course, I had my Black Lives Matter shirt on. One of them took a picture of it, which I was super happy about. So hopefully, I'll get some more good attention in my sort of little mini protest as well. But so I think it's also important to understand too why Black Lives Matter Toronto blocked the parade. Now, you see, in recent years, Pride Toronto had been a largely white institution, and it had especially a big problem with large corporate donors coming to walk into the parade, who would push out smaller queer-owned businesses, doing things like causing the fees to have booths be jacked up so high that smaller queer-owned businesses could no longer afford to have a booth or to walk in the parade, and also resulting in the pretty systematic defunding of any group that was specifically focused on people of color, like Black queer youth, I think Blackness Yes or Blackness Okay, Blockorama as well, and like events which were centered on people of color found themselves being pushed further and further and further away from the route and pushed into venues which were not suitable for their events. And so, Black Lives Matter, before they walked in the parade, sort of like talked to a lot of queer LGBT people. And some of the leadership of Black Lives Matter Toronto are queer themselves. And so they had heard a lot of these concerns about Pride Toronto and, of course, about the police walking in the parade as well. Of course, with the Toronto police not really necessarily having the best track record when it comes to not harassing people of color and only really relatively joining the parade themselves as well. The police chief walked in the parade for the very first time in 2005 in response to Pride Toronto's 25th anniversary. That's the earliest date I can really find, and I would assume that that's when the police started walking as well. They could have maybe walked earlier, I don't know, but that's when the police chief first walked in the parade. So they had heard a lot of these concerns about how Pride Toronto wasn't really being inclusive. And so Black Lives Matter staged the sit-in, not just to try to get the police out of the parade, but also to try to get funding back for things like Blockorama, Black Queer Youth, the South Asian Showcase, also to try and ensure that Pride Toronto hired more trans people of color, queer people of color, disabled people as well, because Pride Toronto had also had a big problem with accessibility as well, and sort of a whole, and also Indigenous people as well. And actually, I've read several articles about this, and it's actually quite interesting about how Black Lives Matter in Canada really has kind of joined in with like the Indigenous rights movement a lot as well. And so I heard one leadership member of Black Lives Matter Toronto say is like, oh, we are Black Lives Matter on Indigenous land. And so I thought that that was very interesting. But yeah, so they heard all of these concerns, and so they staged the sit-in to try and bring this. But of course, the media pretty much focused exclusively on the exclusion of the police force in the parade. And guess what? Toronto City Council, one of the councillors introduced a bill to try and withdraw Pride funding for 2017. Believe it or not. I know, right? Luckily, it was defeated, I think 27-17. Luckily, but still, I think that kind of shows. And there was such a huge outcry about this, and like people saying like, oh, like police should not be at like Pride at all. They should not even look out for it. Like if someone tries to blow it up, they should just like let it happen. All this stuff, and I think it really did expose. I think even still today, not just in Canada, I think, but I think a lot in general about how LGBT acceptance is still a problem, but it's a problem in a unique way. The problem is that the minute that people, that they're not the focus of it, or that the minute that they are told, hey, maybe this isn't for you, maybe you should step out of this, the minute that they're not included in it, then the acceptance immediately goes away. And that was really what was on display in the aftermath of Pride 2016 was, that it's acceptance, but it's conditional, a conditional acceptance, which in the end is really not acceptance at all. And that showed, this exposed all of that. And like it showed, and Pride Toronto was basically like, do it, take the funding away. That's not though to say that this hasn't also had a negative impact as well. A lot of corporate sponsors have since pulled out of the Pride Parade. Certainly it was very heavily corporatized before, and that was a bad thing. As I said, it pushed out a lot of queer-owned businesses. But the drawback of that is that Pride Toronto doesn't have as much funding now. It doesn't have as much money coming in, and in fact, the 2017 parade had about a $500,000 deficit. So, it hasn't been entirely beneficial. But at the same time, I kind of like a smaller parade. At least it's not as busy, and I hate crowds, so it was much better for me anyway, because I didn't have to worry about really trying to muscle your way, because it really was ridiculous. It like before, it really was like completely ridiculous. The huge number of crowds that were there. But yeah, but this also isn't the very first time that Pride Toronto has had its funding threatened either. There was in the 2009 Pride Parade, there was a group called Queers Against Israeli Apartheid that caused quite a stir and quite an uproar, especially around kind of the pro-Israel people in the community. So much so that one of the Toronto City Councillors brought forth another motion to withdraw funding if the group is not banned. Pride Toronto did ban the group from the 2010 Pride Parade and did it again in 2011 when, once again, it was threatened with its funding being withdrawn. Again, so this isn't also the first time that this has happened either. Sort of the minute that Pride sort of starts to try to get political or controversial, they start pulling on the purse strings. People get upset and the purse strings start getting pulled. So again, like this isn't new, as with a lot of things aren't new, just like how police violence against LGBT people in Toronto and in Canada as a whole isn't new as well. And that's also kind of what I want to get into, because the reason why people don't want the police walking in the parade is because the police still have a lot of issues. They have not been all that, good to the LGBT community, known as the Gay Village in Toronto. They haven't been all that sympathetic to them. Some recent events have borne that out, but this also isn't new. It's something which goes back years, pretty much to the origin of the police service itself. For a very long time, police services all around the world, their job largely was to protect the public from gay people. Queer people were the ones who the police targeted because we were seen as public nuisances. And in a lot of ways, we still are seen as public nuisances, and you're going to hear more about that later. And, it hasn't stopped. It's still going on to this day. And so having the police walk in the Pride Parade maybe is, maybe they haven't earned that. Maybe they haven't done enough to earn that yet. And maybe there are people at the parade who, that sort of thing leaves a bad taste in their mouth because maybe just yesterday they were harassed by the police. It still happens. And, I had this argument with this one woman on Twitter saying how, like, oh, but like having the police there, like it bridges the gap. Like it builds the bridge. It shows that you're there at the table. It's like, well, we already are at the table. We already want to work well with the police because the police are supposed to protect us. Like, we're already there. We're already willing to work with the police. We're already willing to give them a shot. And if their acceptance is, conditional on them being included in the parade, and if they're not, then all of a sudden they're not accepting anymore, which the Toronto Police Service, they sure gave us, that impression in the aftermath of 2016, then maybe actually they weren't all that accepting of us in the first place. And the thing is too is that the police as an institution need to be held to a higher standard than that. The police don't get to pick and choose who they protect. They don't get to be prejudiced against someone, against a group, because they are supposed to protect everyone. And like I'm not one of those people who calls for the abolishment of policing in general. I totally think that modern policing needs to be completely dismantled and needs to be rebuilt from the ground up. Like, it needs so much change. It needs so much like work. It needs to be such a huge focus. Policing in the modern world is terrible and it needs to change, absolutely. But I'm not one of those people who says that police are inherently just on the face of it bad. Because I'm also a gay person. I'm also a mentally ill person, and someone needs to protect us. As much as the police have hurt us, the public hurts queer people too. They come after us too. There's a whole history of, even in Canada, there's a whole history of LGBT people being murdered, even to this day, by straight people, by straight society. And someone needs to protect us. And the people who are calling for the abolition of police maybe aren't the ones who are willing to come in and protect us in their stead. So like that's kind of how I fall on it. Like, if you want to abolish the police, fine, but you better be out there willing to stand in front of the angry mob to protect us. You had better be out there protecting us, because we're the ones who get hurt with policing being taken away. But as I've also said too, though, the police have not always been that kind to the LGBT community in Toronto and in Canada in general. And I've got this list here of some of the big events around this sort of thing. And hopefully this will show you guys that this is a long history. This has a very, very long history. The very first date I was able to find was in 1947, where a man named John Herbert, an Eaton's employee and part-time drag queen, was arrested in Toronto for dressing as a woman in public. He was sentenced to 4 months in a youth detention center. Interestingly, actually, though, as a side note, his experiences in jail would later inspire his 1967 work, his play, Fortune and Men's Eyes, which is a landmark in both LGBT literature and general theater and in Canadian literature. It's actually since become Canada's most published play, having been translated into over 40 languages and produced in over 100 countries. So, that's a pretty cool little factoid I found out. But throughout the late 1950s and the entirety of the 1960s, the RCMP, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, basically kind of our version of the FBI, I guess, kept tabs on the LGBT community and the patrons of gay bars in Ottawa and other cities. It also even worked with the FBI in its own surveillance of the LGBT community and alerted the FBI when suspected homosexuals crossed the border into the United States. They would employ what was called the fruit machine during their hiring, where basically they would show workers and would-be applicants gay pornography. And if your pupils dilated too much, you were labeled as a dangerous homosexual. You either didn't get your job or you would get fired. And a large number of workers lost their jobs as a result of this. And even though the funding for the Fruit Machine project was cut in the late 1960s, the investigations continued. And the RCMP collected files on over 9,000 suspected homosexuals. And it goes on. You want to go to other parts of Canada? Sure. In 1965, Everett George Clippert was interrogated by police as part of an arson investigation in the Northwest Territories, one of our provinces, or one of our territories, because it's topic for another video. Anyway, Clippert was arrested after admitting that he had had sex with other men. When psychologists determined that he was unlikely to stop having sex with men, he was declared a dangerous offender and sentenced to life in prison. This was in 1965. Not the 1940s, not the 1950s, 1965. There was a public outcry over this, and Clippert was luckily released in 1971. Then we really sort of start to get into a pattern in the 1970s. In 1975 and 1976, there were large-scale protests in both Montreal and Ottawa after police raided gay establishments in Quebec and in Ottawa in preparation for the 1976 Olympics, basically purging the provinces of gay people in response to the Olympics. In 1977, 2 gay establishments in Montreal, Mystique and Trucks, were raided. The protests, organized the next day, attracted 2,000 participants. Protesting is not new in Canadian LGBT history, and in fact, most Pride celebrations in Canada originate as protests. It was as a result of this that Quebec became the first jurisdiction in terms of sheer size in the world, and second only to Denmark, to prohibit discrimination based on sexual orientation in the public and private sectors. You want to go back to Toronto? Sure. In 1979, several gay activists staged a sit-in protest in the offices of Roy McMurtry, the Attorney General of Ontario, to demand a meeting about police and legal harassment of the gay community. Now, for those of you who are saying, well, it can't have been all bad, it's like, well, it wasn't all bad. In 1980, for the very first time, police presence protected gay spectators and drag queens from anti-gay harassment at the annual Halloween show at Toronto's St. Charles Tavern. So, it's nice that maybe they actually did something good for once. But there was kind of one singular event that sort of shaped Toronto's gay community and its relationship with the police, and that was what was known as Operation Soap. And it was in 1981 when this happened, during which 4 gay bathhouses were raided by the Toronto Police Service. More than 150 officers descended on the city's gay bathhouses and arrested more than 300 innocent people. I'm talking about men being dragged out of bathhouses naked, beaten and bloodied, thrown into the back of police cars, arrested on charges, most of which would eventually be dismissed, though they would continue with charges against the bathhouse owners. But it was this that is kind of the seminal moment in Toronto LGBT history, because the resulting protests would eventually become Toronto Pride. Toronto Pride started out as a protest, just like, much of, American Pride did as well. And in fact, Operation Soap has been called Canada's Stonewall. And so Pride, as I say on my shirt, Pride is a protest. It has always been a protest. And it took Black Lives Matter to, I think, kind of remind a lot of people in Toronto and in Canada that Pride remains a protest. It will always be a protest. And, even just like the title of that too, like Operation Soap, like you see how they thought of this. They were cleaning up the city. And again, this was 1981. Yeah, granted, 40 years ago, like almost 40 years ago. But like some of those victims are still around today. They're still alive. They are in their 60s now, yeah, but they're still around. And it's also worth noting that the Toronto police only apologized for this in 2016. So maybe they're not as accepting as they've always been. It's also worth noting as well that one of the 4 bathhouses would be raided again 2 years later in 1983. And like to correspond to the Edmonton Pride protest, that happened this year in 1981 as well, the Pisces Health Spa in Edmonton, Alberta was raided by the City of Edmonton Police using the what was called Morality Control Unit, since luckily having been disbanded. 56 men that the police arrested would eventually plead guilty despite the fact that there was no evidence to what the Morality Control Unit was looking for, which was A, prostitutes working in the spa, or B, minors being enticed to enter. Never any such evidence, but they pleaded guilty anyway. And that was sort of the same thing with Operation Soap as well. They were trying to get them to plead guilty. They wanted them to plead guilty. Most of them didn't, luckily. So very few of them were ever charged. But, people are saying, like, oh, that was 40 years ago. Why can't people just let it go? Well, hasn't stopped. In 1994, when I was 2 years after I was born, there was a raid in a Montreal bar where 300 people were maliciously and falsely charged with being in a bawdy house, using a law that dated back to the Victorian era, to the 1800s. Eventually, most of them were, most of them were let go, and the police chief in the resulting scandal would eventually resign. And it doesn't stop in Toronto either. In 2000, the Toronto Police raided an event put on by the Toronto Women's Bathhouse Committee. No charges were laid against the participants, though they did record the name of 10 women. 2 volunteers were charged under the Liquor License Act, even though the event had a special occasion permit to have liquor there. The charges were eventually stayed on constitutional grounds, and under the grounds that the charter rights of the participants have been violated. In the subsequent protests, this was deemed as the panty raid, and the protesters who protested outside of the offices of the 52nd Division of the Toronto Police Service waved panties around in the air as a result of it, which, I can't think of a better way, I think, to protest something like that, I think. And again, the most modern one I've been able to find is in 2002. Goliath's, a bathhouse in Calgary, Alberta, was again raided by Calgary police, and all the charges were eventually dropped again, but they proceeded with charges against the bathhouse owners. So, there is a history of police abuse, of abuse of LGBT people at the hands of the Toronto police force and at the police forces of much of Canada. That's not to say that the police are entirely bad. It's not to say that that's all they do. Obviously, there have been loads of gay hate crimes and stuff. There have been some even in my own town. There was one instance where a lesbian couple was beaten up waiting outside of their son's school as they waited for him to come out, and the police charged that. So, so it's and luckily I haven't been able to find any more bathhouse raids, but in 2016, this was a very interesting little thing. Toronto police instigated what was called Project Marie, an undercover sting operation in Marie Curtis Park in Etobicoke, which had a reputation for gay cruising, and they would eventually lay 89 charges, only one of which was criminal in nature, against 72 people. Basically, the Toronto police had an undercover investigation where they were entrapping gay men cruising in a public park, which, I will say, is not illegal. Propositioning someone for sex in public in Canada is not illegal as long as it is not prostitution. Even prostitution now, I think, is now kind of legalized in Canada. It's kind of a bit of a gray area. But yeah, most of the tickets were by-law infractions such as nuisance or trespassing. And so no one in that was charged under the criminal code. But remember, this was also in the same year when the police were saying, oh, why can't we be let into Pride? While they were fucking doing this. While they were fucking entrapping gay men. While they were already having a fucking sting operation in the city. Can you believe, really? And again, this caused a huge scandal in Toronto. But what has caused an even bigger scandal, just this year, is, it turns out Toronto police, that they had allowed a serial killer to actually work in the gay village from between 2010 and 2017. Now, they didn't know about him all the time, but here's the thing. There had been rumors going around the Toronto gay village for a while that there was a serial killer working in the city, because there had been a string of disappearances that had been, people do disappear from the gay village on occasion. People disappear in a big city like that. That's not to say that gay people are more inclined. I've had that too. People disappear. Gay people disappear all the time. It's we're these mercurial little fairies It was like, oh, I'm just going to go away now. See ya, bye. It's like, or like we have like such worse lifestyle. Like, oh, our lifestyles. Like, oh, people, like we live such dangerous lifestyles nowadays. Like, ugh, not like we are any more dangerous than any other community out there. You know. But there have been rumors, and the police repeatedly has said, no, no, no. There's no serial killer. There's nothing. Nope, 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 nope. All the meanwhile, they were investigating this. This was going on, and the Toronto gay community repeatedly, like gay community leaders went there repeatedly, over and over and over again to the police, saying like, hey, we really think that this is suspicious. We really think that this is bad. We really think that there's something going on here. And repeatedly, they were told that there was nothing there, all the while they were investigating it. You may say, oh, well, they didn't want to reveal it. Like, when you have a serial killer in place, you at least tell potential victims, Like, if a serial killer, for instance, is preying on prostitutes, you put it around the local prostitutes, saying, like, hey, we're investigating some suspicious stuff here. If you see anything, like, tell us. But no community leader ever knew about anything like this. The only time they ever found out about it was when the guy was arrested, a man named Bruce McArthur, who has now been charged with 8 counts of first-degree murder, having killed and dismembered his victims and hidden them in flower pots and during his landscaping practice. So maybe Black Lives Matter was right. You think? Maybe? Like seriously, like a fucking serial killer. A fucking serial killer was in the community, was going on in the community. And if anything, this is the one thing which has kind of been the death of any resistance in the gay community to the Toronto police like not being allowed to walk in Pride. Like this was it. This was the thing that the entire like even the gay people who were defending the police were saying like, yeah, not in the fucking parade this year. Not in the parade this year. Not happening. And if anything, this has kind of been the one event which has really, really severely damaged the gay community's kind of trust in the police. Because if you can't trust the police to tell you to even not say like, hey, we're investigating a serial killer, like we're not expecting them to do that, but at least put it around. And like the only advice we ever got from the police was, well, just don't go on, if you're worried about it, just don't go on gay dating apps. Like, oh, thank you. Like, we're not allowed in gay bars anymore because you fucking raid them. We're not allowed in public parks because you fucking entrap us there. And now we're not allowed online either because now we're going to be afraid of being fucking murdered. Like, that's the thing. It's like the police, so, like, even to this day, like, even as early as 2016 and 2018, continually police, gay sexuality, continually police our ability to talk to each other and our ability to meet each other and, have sex. The policing of gay bodies is nothing new. It's still continuing to this day, and all of this has shown it. And kind of the thing that really put salt in the wound was the Toronto police chief going onto the news and saying, like, basically, like, well, if you guys were worried about it, you should have come to us. And, that maybe the reason why we didn't arrest him sooner is because the community wasn't being cooperative with us. And which the community responded basically with a collective, fuck you, all the way up. Like, eat our collective ass. Like, that, like, pissed so much of the community off. Like, the community was just done at that point, and it has been done. Like, this has opened up so many wounds and has become such a huge issue now. Maybe you guys have even heard of it. I wouldn't be surprised if you guys have even heard of the serial killer in the gay community. And it's like, if anything, this is the one thing kind of that has brought kind of the entirety of the LGBT community in Toronto over to the side of Black Lives Matter and made us see like, hey, they were fucking right. They were right. The police really don't care about us. They really aren't looking out for our best interests anymore. And the police, have set up a liaison and, everything and stuff, but, like, they're not going to be getting anywhere for a while now. And again, like, I've heard people, like, try to make justifications, but, like, again, like, you can't even tell us. And then you also blame us, too. And that's also, like, even omitting the fact, too, that, like, even smaller events, too, that don't necessarily make the news, You see, like, in Philadelphia, I think that there was a trans activist who was arrested literally in the Pride Parade by the police. And it's like you only need to type in arrested at Pride into Twitter to see events like this, to come across these sorts of events. It's not new. It's still happening as well. And so, like, personally, myself, I have to say that if I just talk about myself, if I'm just talking about my experiences with the police, I have had no bad experiences with the police, but I suspect largely because that I am white. I suspect largely because I am cis white, because I'm a cis white guy, and like, and but I can't say that it's not also personal to me because I hear so many stories of people who have had bad problems with the police, and so I'm like, well, if like there are people here who have problems with the police, then totally, we absolutely should, like, they should not be allowed to walk in the parade because I always like, and like as I said before, like individual police, they're still allowed to go to the parade. You just can't wear your uniforms. They just can't like walk as an institution. And that's kind of how I see it, is that like I support, like sort of like how I do with the military too. Like I support individual police officers, I support individual military members, and like you can fucking get angry at me for that. Go right the fuck ahead. I don't fucking care. I will support the individual people, but I do not support the institutions. It's the institutions that I hold accountable for this bullshit. For all the bullshit that comes out as a result of, the actions of, military and, bad policing. It's the institutions which are to blame for this. They are the ones who are to be held accountable. Certainly, if a police officer does bad shit, then they absolutely deserve to be held accountable, and they should be held accountable. But the ones I don't support, because I do understand that there are good cops. Are good cops. There are good soldiers. I write about them sometimes in my books. Some of the characters in my books are cops. But like the ones I don't support are the institution of policing, because it is the institution of policing that is ultimately held to be account for allowing this sort of stuff to continue. And so, like, as an institution, the police are not allowed in there. And I'm sorry that, individual officers suffer for this. But again, it's the fault of the police. It's their problem. You know? As I've said, as I think I have illustrated pretty well, the police have not been kind to the LGBT community. It has a lot of sins against our community, and our community does not have to forgive it. It is not our job to forgive the atrocity, to forgive the bigotry, to forgive the control, the amount of control that it still tries to, have over gay bodies, over LGBT bodies. It's not our job to make the police kind to us. It's the police's job to be kind to us. They're the ones who need to be held to account. And like if their acceptance of us is, dependent on them walking in the parade, then fuck them. Then fuck the police. Because then it's not really acceptance, is it? And like, but also at the same time, like, I do feel sorry for the LGBT, police officers. I feel sorry for them. I, of course, am sympathetic to them. Like, I get it. I understand, sometimes even online, like with the way discourse is online, sometimes I, get kind of burned out sometimes too. When, people, say that, certain things, I kind of feel like, well, like, yeah, like I'm white or like I'm cis, but I'm not one of those people, but at the same time, like I'm bigger than that. I don't, my acceptance of trans people, of people of color is not dependent on their acceptance of me, is not dependent on them making me feel good. And you know what? I get it. Like people like me have been shit for trans people and people of color for a long time, and they are totally justified in that anger. And so, and in the end, like if it comes down to including police at Pride and excluding, queer people of color and, trans people, or including queer people of color and trans people, or and people who have had bad experiences with police, because it's not just trans and people of color either. There are loads of other people too who have had bad experiences with the police too. And excluding the police, like, which are we expected to do? Do we betray our own kind? Do we kick out our own kind for the benefit of an institution which still, to this day, commits crimes against us, still unlawfully arrests us, still does not put our safety as a priority? Or do we actually accept our own? Do we embrace our own? And the fact that there are people in this world who still expect us, to neglect our own, to, try to include the people who, let's be frank, very often are our oppressors. Fuck that. And fuck anyone who believes that. Fuck anyone who believes that it is our responsibility to try to gain our own acceptance. Fuck them. So, I knew this was going to be an angry video. I knew it. I fucking knew it. And, like, this also isn't exclusive to the police as well. Alberta, the Alberta Pride Parades have kicked out the United Conservative Party of Canada. The United Conservative Party of Alberta, because its leader, Jason Kenney, is trying to push through a bill which will require parents to be notified if their children join gay-straight alliances, basically trying to force schools to out children, or at least snitch on their children. And as a result, the United Conservative Party of Alberta has been banned from Edmonton Pride and pretty much all prides in Alberta. And even here in Ontario, Premier-elect Diet Trump, sorry, Doug Ford, I always have that problem with him. I don't know why. Has called Pride Parade goers, and I'm quoting here, middle-aged men with pot bellies running down the street buck naked, which is not only insulting, it is also not illegal during Pride Parade and the street fair. You are allowed to walk around naked at the Toronto Pride Parade. Believe it or not, it's not illegal. And so, yeah, hopefully I've kind of thoroughly debunked that. I think that it's an issue I don't think is going to be going away anytime soon. I think it's going to be talked about for a little while in the wake of this parade, and I think it will probably be talked about next year. And I think it'll probably be talked about, the Bruce McArthur case is still going on. The investigation is still going on. They still have, victims that they still haven't identified yet. So that's going to be an open wound for a long time to come. And do I see the police ever really being allowed to walk in the parade? Like, sure, maybe one day. We can hope for it. I certainly look forward to the day when it's possible, when the police have done enough to do it, but I don't see it happening anytime soon. I definitely don't think that I think definitely in Toronto, I think in everything that's happened in the last couple of years with, Project Marie, and now especially with the Bruce McArthur serial killer case, they're not going to be getting any slack from the gay community for a long time. They are not going to be able to say anything to the gay community for a very, very long time. They are not going to be happy. And they're not going to trust the police. And really, quite frankly, can you really blame them? Like, after everything that's happened in the last couple of years, I think especially with the Bruce McArthur case, like, you can't blame them for this. I certainly don't. Like, I'd be horrified. I am horrified. I still to this day am horrified. I don't even live in Toronto. I'm still horrified. And it shows that, anyway, it's not just the serial killer case. There are murders that have happened, in the village too, which, the Toronto gay community have said weren't properly investigated, were treated very coldly, disappearances that weren't, investigated for literal weeks because the police just didn't think that it was important. Because again, gay people go missing all the time, right? Gay people just disappear, apparently. And, and I've even had arguments with actual people who live in the actual village defending the police. And it's sad that that happens, but, I just hope that at the very least people can see why this is happening. And, and if you guys in the comments want to talk about like any experiences you've had with the police, but also like things that are happening down in the States too, because I haven't really been able to see a lot of like this happening in the States. But then again, maybe you guys haven't included the police in your pride parades as much. I guess they were included in New York Pride at the very least. So, I'd be really interested to hear, like, has this sort of stuff affected you? Because it'd be really interesting see if it's gone the other way. If it, because news so often, comes upwards, goes upwards to us here. American news so often, comes to us. It'd be really interesting, though, if it went the other way, if Canadian news affected American communities and stuff, So, but I think that's enough doom and gloom. I can't really think of any other arguments that I could make that I wouldn't have already said in this video already. Hopefully, I've made a good enough case for this. I figured that I just end this video because I had to do a lot of research for this. And so I just sort of figured I'd finish off with, some interesting facts that I came across in my research about Canadian LGBT history. This isn't a comprehensive list by any means, but it's just kind of stuff that I thought was really interesting and stuff. Of course, number one is that like a lot of indigenous communities, and I knew this before, like I didn't need research to tell me this, that like, of course, like indigenous communities have, a much different history with LGBT acceptance and stuff than, settler Canadians do. And I say this because like this list is primarily when Canada was being settled, or rather when Canada was being conquered and colonized. So yeah, that's why I say that. So and we don't have a lot of that history because colonialism and residential schools, like, and if you don't know about that, like seriously, go read about it. It'll depress you to no end, but you need to know it. We need to bear witness to that at the very least, So, but I say that because like this is not a comprehensive list, as I've said, but there's just like some interesting stuff that I came across, and like if there were like, and if I could have found some like Indigenous Canadian history, LGBT history, I totally would have put this in. Any of you guys like have any information like that, then like totally put it in the comments below. I love learning about Indigenous history. It's one of my absolute favorite topics to research. I find it endlessly fascinating. I find it so amazing and beautiful. And, so like I would totally love that. But I haven't included much here because I simply just couldn't find a lot of it. Because LGBT history, Indigenous history, two things that are only fairly recently been researched, and like they've kind of just been only, that's kind of a very slim Venn diagram, and also Canadian history too, so like a very slim Venn diagram there. So one of the most interesting things I actually found, though, actually dates back, the earliest one I was able to find dates back to 1648. A military drummer stationed at the French garrison of Ville-Marie in New France was sentenced to death for sodomy by the local Sulpican priests. However, the Jesuits intervened, and the drummer's life was spared on the condition that he accept the position of New France's official first permanent executioner. Only the drummer was placed on trial, though, which makes us believe that actually consensus amongst historians is that his partner may have been an Indigenous man, a First Nations man as we call them up here, who was not subject to French law. No one knows who this drummer is. And now, I think that would be a fucking amazing story. Like, come on. Like a settler, like a military drummer stationed in a French garrison in, pre-Confederation Canada, and an Indigenous man in a relationship and in love, and the man, being charged with sodomy and being sentenced to death, only to have his life spared, but having to, like, live as an executioner, having to kill people just so that he can remain alive, to continue to live in this world with the man he loves. Like, that would be an amazing story. Like, that would be an amazing story to read, wouldn't it? I'd love to read that book. I'd love to watch that movie. And in fact, also very interestingly, even though numerous men were sentenced to death by the courts on sodomy charges in pre-Confederation Canada, there is not a single surviving record that we've been able to find so far of a convicted sodomite actually being executed in Canada. Rather, it seems that the death sentences were commonly commuted either to life in prison or to deportation, or they were pardoned by colonial governors. So, very interesting. Another very interesting fact is that in Montreal in 1918, the very first known LGBT publication in Canada and North America as a whole, Le Manche Fantastique, was published by Elsa Gidlow and Roswell George Mills. It didn't last very long. It was only about 5 issues before they moved to New York City in the early 1920s. But still, like, I didn't know this. Like, the very first LGBT magazine publication in North American history was printed in Montreal. And also very interesting fact, H.P. Lovecraft actually very heavily criticized the magazine in an essay in 1918. So not only was H.P. Lovecraft horrifically racist, maybe he was also homophobic too. What do you know? This next one's actually quite relevant as well, because this man was just featured in a Canadian history moment, which are kind of like these little historical kind of vignettes that show on, that are produced by the Canadian government and show on TV every once in a while. And a man named Jim Egan was a Toronto native, and he's now seen as one of the foundational figures in LGBT activism in Canada, because When he reached the age of 65, he and his partner, John Nesbitt, applied for old age security, something that they are entitled to. But when Nesbitt applied for spousal benefits under Egan's plan, he was denied. He was denied under the grounds that they were two men, and same-sex partners were not seen as being a spouse as defined by the law. This would eventually go to the Supreme Court of Canada, and even though they would dismiss the case, it did set a precedent for gay rights activism in Canada, basically setting a groundwork for every legal case that would come. And it would also eventually affirm that homosexuality was not grounds for discrimination under the law. However, this did take until 1995, so again. Other very interesting fact, the periodical Gay was published in Toronto. It was actually Toronto's very first official gay magazine, and is the very first periodical in the world to use gay in its title. It would actually eventually expand into the US under the title Gay International, and it would sell thousands of copies every issue, but was canceled in 1966 when one of its central creators was arrested on criminal charges. For those of you who are interested, the very first same-sex marriage in Canada took place in Winnipeg between Chris Vogel and Richard North. This would eventually spark the legal case of Vogel versus Canada, which would eventually lead to same-sex legalization in Manitoba in 2004. It's also worth noting, however, that the two are still fighting. They're still together to this day. Congratulations to them, very, very good. But also they are still fighting to this day to have their marriage legally recognized as having occurred in 1974, not 2004. And their 1974 marriage certificate is currently on display in the Canadian Museum for Human Rights. Americans, this will probably sting a little bit. Canada lifted the ban on homosexuals in the Canadian Armed Forces and in the military in 1982. We were actually one of the very first modern countries to allow homosexuals in the military. So yeah, that's kind of on you. So this is actually very interesting. Actually, from my hometown, actually in Oshawa, in 2002, a young gay student named Mark Hall at a Catholic school here in the city wanted to take his same-sex partner to prom, but the school forbid it, and he actually eventually took the school to court, and the judge agreed with him and let him take his date to prom. So I thought that was very cool. I actually never heard about that, but then again, I was about 10 at the time, so it's not surprising, but still, I thought that was very cool when I found out about it. Gay marriage in Canada was legal by 2005, and in 2012, after a legal battle to reverse her disqualification, Vancouver resident Jenna Talakova successfully becomes the very first transgender woman to compete in a Miss Universe pageant. She did not make the top 5, but was one of the 4 contestants awarded the title of Miss Congeniality. So, that's a little kind of, I think, overview of Canadian history. I kind of left out a lot of very boring stuff or stuff I repeated earlier. So, it's not all bad. I think that there's a really great, LGBT history up here in Canada that I really want to see more people delve into. I don't know, maybe I'll do that for a future video. I don't know. I'm kind of burned out from this one, quite frankly. I tried to record this once already, but it was terrible, and so I had to scrap it and try something else. And so I got this one. I think that this one turned out pretty well. Hopefully it's relatively clear. Hopefully my voice is clear too. I've been talking for over an hour now, so I'm sorry about that. Yeah, I think that's... Hopefully it was all pretty clear and concise. Hopefully I make sense. I never really know if I'm making sense until I go back and edit. Again, that's kind of the stream of consciousness. If I sounded really terrible while I was reading the notes, you guys will know why it's a stream of consciousness. Trust me, this is the better of 2 evils in this circumstance. It really is. Trust me. I think that there's just one last thing I want to tell you guys. I had previously been putting up my my podcast on SoundCloud, as well as on YouTube as an alternative. But here's a bit of a thing. I recently found out that when I uploaded my last podcast up on there, turns out SoundCloud on a free account only allows you about 4 hours of total data space. So I can only upload 4 hours of podcast up onto SoundCloud under a free account. And since my podcasts tend to run over an hour, the last episode pushed me over that. So any future episodes that I post up there will hide earlier ones. So as a result of that, I've decided that I'm not going to post on SoundCloud until I'm able to start making money off of this channel. once I'm able to start making money off of this channel, and once I'm able to afford the $16 a month to be able to have a premium SoundCloud account and unlimited storage on SoundCloud, then I'll put them all back up there. But until that time, I'm afraid I'm going to have to keep it off of SoundCloud for the time being. And so, yeah, so wish me luck at Pride on Sunday. I'm really looking forward to it. Yes, I'm going with my dad again, because, again, no one else wanted to go with me. So, and my dad's, again, kind of protective, and he didn't want me to get, like, he goes there just in case I get punched. So I don't think I'm going to. I was fine last year, so I'd happily go alone if I could, but it's at least nice to have someone to hold my backpack. So yeah, wish me luck. Uh, I've redesigned my shirt. Hope you guys like it. It's again like the thumbnail of this episode is the image of my shirt and the sign. If you want more pictures of the shirt, I can happily post them up on my Twitter. I have loads of pictures of it because I'm very happy with it. During this, I've also discovered my love of spray glitter. Oh, I love spray glitter. Oh, it's so much fun. I kind of want to spray all my wardrobe with spray glitter now. Sparkly. Everything must be sparkly. So, yeah. Uh, I think that this went pretty well. Hopefully I've done, I think, this issue justice. I really hope I did. And so, this video, of course, will probably be up later in the month, near the end of the month. And the next video, I think, will probably be a review. Not entirely sure what I think. I think I've got one thing that I maybe want to review, but we'll see. So yeah. Until next time, may the privilege be with you. Stay entitled, snowflakes. Happy Pride!